seconds, it got quiet again. I'm wearing more sparkles today. I hope you appreciate that. Anyway, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. It looked kind of rainy there for a while, but obviously our lighthouse expert has brought some light. So thank you for that. Our speaker this evening, Jeremy D'Entremont, has been called the leading expert in New England historic lighthouses. He is the author or co-author of 20 books, including The Lighthouses of Massachusetts, The Lighthouses of Maine, The Lighthouses of Rhode Island.
There's a theme
there. Yes, I detect the theme. Jeremy D'Entremont is the president and historian for the American Lighthouse Foundation. The theme continues. Founder of the Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses, and the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. He has appeared on the History Channel, the Travel Channel, Public Television, and National Public Radio. He also produces weekly and hosts a weekly podcast called Lighthearted for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Our sponsors tonight include Ken Morton, who, as many of you know, owns the Sandy Neck Lighthouse. And maybe Mr. D'Entremont will talk a little bit about Sandy Neck Lighthouse. Our other sponsors are Jim Fitzgerald and Linda Shannon. Thank you. And the George Family Trust. And tonight we have Lloyd and his lovely daughter, Amanda. Welcome. So after the presentation tonight, please join us in the reception hall for the delicious desserts of Miss Jude. I'd like to introduce Jeremy D'Entremont.
Thank you so much, Ann. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, excellent. What a beautiful building facility here. I've never been in here before. This is really, really nice. And my ride here was a little eventful today through torrential rain and the bridge, Sagamore Bridge, being shut down for quite a while. That was interesting, but the important thing is I made it. It was shut down because of flooding near the bridge. But anyway, that's in the past. So it's great to be here, and my talk tonight is sort of a general talk. I do talk mostly about two particular lighthouses, not Cape Cod lighthouses, but Boston Light, Boston Harbor being the first light station in North America, and Minot's Ledge Light down or over near Cohasset and Scituate. I talk quite a bit about that because to me they're kind of emblematic of certain types of lighthouses, and I'll explain that in a while. But starting out here, I just want to say, I think it's pretty obvious people love lighthouses. I think that's why you're here tonight. Great to see such a good turnout. And I would say that lighthouses are probably the most used positive symbol in our culture. It's hard to think of anything else that would compete. Churches use them, schools use them, all kinds of businesses use them to stand for strength and hope and guidance and just all kinds of positive things. For me, I first got interested in lighthouses in the 80s. I started photographing them. I fell in love with their beauty. Obviously, they're often beautiful. They're often in beautiful surroundings. But then I started to read about them, and I realized how interesting the human history is of these lighthouses, the stories of lighthouse keepers and their families, how devoted they were to keep those lights no matter what, and fog signals in many cases as well. That light and fog signal had to be going as needed no matter what. It didn't matter if there was a hurricane or blizzard or somebody in your family was sick or dying, whatever the case may be. The light was on sunset to sunrise, absolutely no matter what, and the fog signal was going in times of poor visibility. So, and it's a way of life that is fading into history at this point. We have about 800 or so, give or take a few, because there's not strict agreement on what makes a proper lighthouse. What is the definition of a lighthouse? There's some disagreement about that. But we have a bit over 800 lighthouses in this country, still standing, and about half of them, maybe a little bit more than that, are still active aids to navigation. And if they're still active, that means that the Coast Guard maintains the lights themselves. Coast Guard agency navigation teams go out and check the light periodically. A lot of the offshore lights are now solar-powered LEDs that do not require much attention, maybe just one visit a year, pretty much run themselves. But even though the Coast Guard is still running the lights in a lot of lighthouses, the Coast Guard doesn't have the budget to care for the structures, for the historic structures, so it's falling to nonprofit organizations largely, also some towns and cities that own some of the lighthouses, sometimes national parks, state parks, and sometimes private owners, like Ken's not here. Is Ken Morton here? No, he's not here. Okay. But I am going to talk a little bit about Ken. But there's a lot of great private owners as well. So in general, I like to call the owners of today, the nonprofits and other entities that take care of these lighthouses, they are the lighthouse keepers of today. But I just want to say a little bit more, starting out here, about the job of a lighthouse keeper. A few years ago, I remember a woman said to me, so what was the job of a lighthouse keeper? Did he switch a light on and go to bed and then get up in the morning and switch the light off? Was that the job of a keeper? Well, sort of, but it was a little more complicated than that. Especially, that's good. They don't need to see me, they just need to see the pictures. So it was a little more complicated, especially in the oil lamp days, in the days of kerosene. It required a lot of attention to keep that light burning properly. So I should mention something important here. The federal government, our new federal government, formed a lighthouse service on August 7th, 1789. The first Public Works Act of the first Congress was to form a lighthouse service. Before that, the first lighthouses were built by the individual colonies, 11 of them before the Revolution. But a federal lighthouse service was formed under the Treasury Department with Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, being the first person in charge of our lighthouses. It stayed under the Treasury Department for a long time. For a while in the 20th century, it was under the Commerce Department. And the Coast Guard took over management of our lighthouses in 1939. But from 1789 to 1939, lighthouse keepers were civilian employees of the federal government. So in 1928, the powers that be in the lighthouse service asked all the keepers at that time to write down their duties as a keeper. And you see Fairfield Moore here. He was a keeper for a number of years at the very popular Nubble Lighthouse in York, Maine. I'm sure some of you have been there. It's one of the most photographed lighthouses in the world. It gets about 500,000 visitors a year. He had 2 grandchildren born on the island, by the way, just a little aside. But these are some of the things he wrote down describing his duties. A lot of it has to do with keeping the light going, sunset to sunrise. But not only did he have to, just light the light and put it out at sunrise, but he had to maintain that equipment, the very finicky incandescent oil vapor lamp, the kerosene lamp they had at that time. He had to really have mechanical aptitude. He had to take care of that equipment. He also had to activate the fog bell in times of fog. A lot of lighthouses had fog horns of one kind or another. Some of them had steam horns. Keepers would shovel coal into a boiler as needed to get the horn going. Later they had compressed air horns. But a lot of lighthouses had fog bells, including Nubble. Some of the ones on Cape Cod, Nobsca and Woods Hole, for one, had fog bells for a while too. But Nubble had its fog bell until the early 1960s. The tower was torn down. But you see that picture there, and you can actually see the bell hanging on the side of that tower there. It was a 1,000-pound bronze bell, and in times of fog, the keeper would go into that shed, he would crank up a clockwork machine, and a hammer would strike the bell every so many seconds. I forget exactly what it was for Nubble, maybe one blow every 15 seconds. So if you're out in the water in your boat in the fog and you couldn't see a thing, including the light, sometimes it was too foggy to see the light, you would at least hear the clang of that bell every 15 seconds, and that would help tell you where you were. You didn't have GPS or anything in those days. So the fog bells, the fog signals in general were considered just as important as the lights, and he had to maintain all that equipment. He had to keep everything spick and span. The buildings had to be painted in perfect shape. The grass had to be mowed, etc. He never knew when the district lighthouse inspector was going to show up and do literally a white glove inspection, and he would be graded on that. And if he had enough bad marks, that was the end of your job. So Nubble was a family station, like a lot of these lighthouses. The keeper lived there in that comfortable keeper's house with his family, and the wives, of course, did a tremendous amount of the work for no pay. The kids often would chip in and do polishing of brass and cleaning of glass. And some places they had animals. They had chickens for a while at Nubble. and the kids would help take care of the animals in a lot of cases too. So, and there's also a lot of paperwork for the keepers to do, records and so forth, observing weather conditions, recording those, observing the other aids to navigation, the buoys and things around to make sure everything was in the right place and functioning properly. So, bottom line, it was more than switching a light on and off. So I am going to talk for a little bit about Boston Light, the first lighthouse on the North American continent. And it is located, as you can see on the map, in outer Boston Harbor. It's actually closer to the town of Hull, which you see in the lower right corner of the map there. And for many years, all the shipping traffic into Boston would go between Boston Light and Hull and up into the harbor that way. And it's on a little island called Little Brewster Island, part of a cluster of islands called the Brewsters there. Little Brewster is at most maybe 2 acres. That's probably at low tide. That's probably being generous. It's a small island. But families lived there for many years at the light station. So it was first established in September 1716, September 14th, 1716, first light on the continent. And there were only a handful of lighthouses in the world at that time, so it was really among the first. And it was established, of course, because Boston was already a very busy port by the early 1700s with trade and shipbuilding and fishing and so forth. And the colonial government, the General Court of Massachusetts, as they called it, hired a keeper, first keeper on the continent, a man named George Worthylake, a local man. He was 43 years old. He had a farm on one of the other harbor islands. He moved to Little Brewster Island with his wife and the 2 youngest of their 5 children, two daughters, and a family servant and 2 slaves. There was a male slave named Shadwell and a female slave named Dinah. And I really, really wish we knew more about the slaves, but basically nothing was recorded about them. There were slaves at some of the early colonial lighthouses. In fact, I just interviewed somebody who's doing a book on Virginia lighthouses, and there were definitely slaves at some of the lighthouses in the Chesapeake. So it's a subject that hopefully is going to be getting a lot more research in the coming years. But anyway, so Worthylake was paid next to nothing by the colonial government. He had to do extra things to make ends meet. To support his family, he served as a harbor pilot. He would go out and meet incoming ships in his boat and help guide them in. He was paid extra for that. He tried having a flock of sheep for a while. That didn't work out so well. He had a flock of 59 sheep, if I remember right. They wandered out on a sand spit at low tide one day. And I probably don't need to finish that thought. You know what tide does, the tide does come in. So unfortunately, that was the end of his flock of sheep. So his sheep had pretty terrible luck, and so did Worthylake. In November of 1718, he went into Boston with his wife and one of their 2 daughters. They went in on a Sunday. Actually, the servant, not the slave, but the family servant went along with them too. They went in on a Sunday, attended church on Sunday morning in Boston, stayed overnight, and on Monday morning, he picked up his pay, and they were traveling back to Boston Light in a sloop, probably similar to the one in this drawing here. And they picked up a family friend at the island, Lovell's Island, where he had his farm. They anchored off of Boston Light. Shadwell, the slave, paddled a canoe out to meet the landing party. There was not a storm, from all accounts, not big waves or anything like that. But as the Worthylake's other daughter and a friend were watching from the island, the canoe capsized, and all 6 of those people drowned. So this is still I usually say it's the worst lighthouse tragedy in American history in terms of loss of life, but I just read, like in the past week, that there was a hurricane in 1846 that destroyed a lighthouse in Florida, it's called Sand Key off the Florida coast, and 6 people died there in that hurricane, the keeper and 5 others. So I believe this Boston Light tragedy is tied as the worst loss of life at a lighthouse in our history. So this is the triple gravestone of George, Ann, and Ruth Worthylake at the Copp's Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End. And there's a couple of interesting footnotes. One is that Cotton Mather, the famous minister in Boston, preached a sermon about what happened. Ben Franklin, 12 years old at the time, living in Boston, wrote a poem called The Lighthouse Tragedy, loosely based on it. And his older brother printed copies, and young Ben hawked copies of The Lighthouse Tragedy on the streets of Boston. Later called it wretched stuff in his autobiography. But one kind of positive footnote is that the stonecutter, the young man who carved this gravestone, subsequently married the Worthylake's surviving daughter. So I guess something good came out of it. And one final footnote is that the second keeper went out to replace Worthy Lake. His name was Robert Saunders, and he also drowned a few days after taking the job. He and 2 other men went out in a boat to meet an incoming ship, and apparently the seas were rough and the boat capsized, and 2 of the 3 died, including Saunders. So people started to wonder if the island was cursed. There were no more tragedies like that, to the best of my knowledge, until the early 1950s when a young Coast Guard keeper, 22 years old, Richard Freedy, drowned in a boat accident along with a contractor. And, you know, just in general, if you research the history of an offshore lighthouse like this, you're almost definitely going to find some tragedies in there somewhere. I always say that lighthouse keeping was not as romantic as you think. People think it was a wonderful way of life, and in many ways it was, but it was also dangerous and could be very difficult. Boston Light was the scene of fighting during the Revolution. The last thing the British did as they were leaving Boston Harbor after occupying the harbor in 1776, last thing they did was to blow up that first lighthouse and left not much behind. There was no lighthouse for 7 years. It was rebuilt by order of Governor John Hancock in 1783. So the lighthouse we have today is the 1783 tower. Interestingly, they did a restoration a few years ago, took all the coatings off the tower, the stucco and paint and everything, and found that the lower, I believe about 9 to 12 feet going around, the stones are much smaller and laid quite differently, and it appears that much of the first lighthouse still stands. It was incorporated into the new one. So some of the first one is still there. So jumping ahead of about 150 years or something like that here, in the interest of time, this is Maurice Babcock. So he was principal keeper from 1926 to 41. This is the other, to me, the other most interesting period of Boston Light history. During the 1930s and 40s. Oh, am I popping into it too much? Is that better? Can you still hear me okay? Okay, I feel like my voice isn't carrying as much now. Is everybody hearing me okay at this point? Okay, all right, just yell if you can't hear me. So anyway, Maurice Babcock, 1926 to 41. At that time, there was a principal keeper and 2 assistant keepers living in 2 houses on the island, and as many as 19 kids living on the island. And again, it was maybe 2 acres at the most. So Babcock in this picture is inside the lens, the second order Fresnel lens. If you're lighthouse buffs, you know about Fresnel lenses, capital F-R-E-S-N-E-L, named for Augustin Fresnel, the French scientist who invented them in the early 1820s. Basically, the glass prisms serve to magnify and focus the light into a very powerful horizontal beam. In this case, it's a rotating second-order lens, meaning second from the largest size that they made. So very powerful light. This light it still is visible for around 25 miles out to sea. And those round panels called bullseyes or flash panels create the flash. So if you're out in a boat, every time one of those flash panels passes between you and the light source, it creates a flash. So Boston Light actually has a flash, a white flash every 10 seconds. And he's tinkering with the incandescent oil vapor lamp there, that very finicky light. So Maurice Babcock, like a lot of lighthouse keepers, didn't see himself as a hero. You know, they were very matter-of-fact about the work they did. This is actually the complete text of a speech he made in 1934 at a historical society gathering. They asked him to make a speech, and he said, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not much of an orator, but I enjoy keeping the light burning for the ships coming in and the fog signal sounding. I thank you. End of speech. So, you know, what more is there to say? That pretty much says it. I interviewed his son in the 1980s, Maurice Jr., and Maurice Jr. told me that the kids in the different families there pretty much got along, but he said it was a little bit territorial. And one time he wandered onto the Norwood family's part of the island without permission. The Norwoods had 9 kids. He went onto their part of the island without asking permission first, and one of the Norwood girls socked him in the nose. So he learned to ask permission. He said they liked to play baseball, but Little Brewster Island was too small. So they would go to Great Brewster Island next door, which was still kind of small, and in the water was out, and the games were pretty short. But you made your own fun at these places. There's really no choice in the matter. This is Ralph Norwood. He was an assistant to Maurice Babcock for some years. when the Coast Guard took over in 1939, they gave the civilian keepers the option of serving out their careers as civilians or joining the Coast Guard. Babcock retired as the last civilian keeper. Ralph Norwood joined the Coast Guard, and he became the first Coast Guard keeper at Boston Light. So and he's here with his wife, Josephine, on the left, and with their 9 kids on the right. And they had all 9 kids before Josephine was 30, which, yeah, that always gets a groan or two. But I interviewed several of those kids, grown kids, back in the early 90s. I actually organized a reunion for some of the families at Boston Light. By the way, Josephine lived to be 100. She died not that many years ago. And the last of the Norwood kids just died a couple of years ago. But for the most part, they loved their life there. One of them told me he hated every minute of it. But, you know, life on an island like that isn't for everybody. But most of them loved it. They boarded with families on the mainland to go to school during the school year in either Winthrop to the north or Hull to the south. But the summers were a glorious time for them. They would sometimes go out to the island for school vacations or weekends, but the summer was just a wonderful time. And again, they would play baseball. They'd have rowboat races with kids on neighboring islands, pie eating contests, a lot of fishing and shellfishing, exploring the other islands, the forts and things, and just basically making their own fun. So Ralph Norwood's grandson, Willie Emerson, self-published a book called First Light about his family's time at Boston Light. If you can find a copy, it's kind of hard to find. It's an interesting book. He interviewed his grandfather, Ralph, in the 1980s, and I'm going to play you an audio clip of Ralph Norwood talking about the duties of a keeper. He was asked what were the duties. But I have the words on the screen because he's a little hard to understand. The recording's not great, and he had a thick Maine accent. But let me play it for you. It was a working job, just like any other job. I love the way he says that. And again, they never saw themselves as heroes, very, very matter-of-fact about it, but completely devoted. And at Boston Light was one of many lighthouses where somebody would always be on watch overnight in the room just below the lantern where the light was, keeping an eye on the light to make sure it didn't go out. That was an important part of the job at a lot of these. Not every lighthouse kept 24-hour watch, or watch all night, but a lot of them did, the more important ones. So the first child born at Boston Light was Georgia Norwood, born to Ralph and Josephine in April of 1932. And she's 5 years old in this picture. The story goes that she was due to be born. Josephine appeared to go into labor. Ralph called a doctor from the town of Hull. He got a boat ride. There was a big storm going on that night. Big, high waves, heavy seas. So the doctor, Dr. Sturgis, and the guy with the boat fought the waves to get out to the island. When they got out there, they could not land the boat. What am I hearing, a cell phone? I'm not sure. I'm trying to think, do I have sound effects in this that I couldn't remember? But anyway, so they couldn't land the boat because the seas were too rough, so they had to turn around and go back to Hull. And as it turned out, it was false labor that night. Josephine did not have the baby that night. She had Georgia a week later in calm weather. But because the doctor had fought those high seas to get out to, or tried to get to the island, it made newspaper headlines, and she was called the Storm Child. And a novelist named Ruth Carman wrote the novel. You see the cover there, Storm Child. It was kind of popular. If you ever find a copy, it's fun to read, but do not take it as a history book. The only true thing is that she was born on the island. The climax of the book has Boston Light destroyed in a tidal wave, which has not happened yet, but hopefully it won't happen. But anyway, some people in Hollywood thought this would make a good movie. So a screenplay was written of Storm Child, and the idea was that Georgia was going to play herself. She was billed as the Bay State's own Shirley Temple. This was a publicity picture for the movie. The family appeared on radio shows and so forth. But then the night before Georgia was going to fly out to California to make the movie, she was crying, and she went to her parents and said, "I don't want to go to Hollywood. I want to stay at Boston Light." So they thought better of it. I don't blame them at all. And they decided that she wouldn't go. They didn't want her to be separated from her family for a while, and the movie was never made. So I understand why they did that, but I feel bad that we don't get to see the movie of First Light. But I always wonder, I guess they couldn't afford Shirley Temple, you know. Whoops. Jumped the gun a little bit there. And I also wonder what happened to the screenplay. You know, is that kicking around somewhere? I'd like to know. Anyway, so jumping ahead in history, Boston Light was due to be the last lighthouse in the country to be automated and de-staffed. Every other lighthouse was automated and the keepers were pulled off by 1990. Boston Light was going to be automated and de-staffed in 1990. I was helping to give tours there in the late 80s. I lived in Winthrop, Mass. at the time. But legislation was passed in October '89, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, to keep a human presence on the island. They actually put money in the Coast Guard budget, and the Coast Guard kept keepers there for some years. But about 18 years ago, the Coast Guard decided they had other things for those personnel to be doing, and they went ahead and hired a civilian keeper. This woman, Sally Snowman, maybe some of you have seen her. She's been on Chronicle and other TV shows and documentaries and things. She is still the keeper 18 or 19 years later. She is the only official lighthouse keeper in the United States employed by the federal government today. First woman keeper in the history of Boston Light. Maurice Babcock was the last civilian keeper until Sally, so she's now the first civilian keeper after all those Coast Guard keepers. And she likes to wear colonial-style dresses that she makes herself. She likes to wave a hanky to passing ships. So she gets into the role. She and her husband are out there a lot, not all the time, in the warmer months. There are Coast Guard auxiliary volunteers called watchstanders who spend shifts out there. So there's almost, at least in the warmer months, there's almost always a human presence out there. But we'll see what happens. I think Sally may be retiring. Also, Boston Light may be transferred to a new owner in the not-too-distant future from the Coast Guard. I won't get too deeply into that, but that is in the works. So we'll see what happens if they still have a keeper position there. So this is a phrase traditionally used in the French lighthouse service, enfer et paradis, meaning hell and heaven. And what it refers to is the two extremes of lighthouse life. On one hand, you have the enfer, or hell, lighthouses, which would be a lighthouse out on a rock, a barren rock way out in the ocean somewhere, or a very small island, or in some cases, you know, some of them are caisson lights that are just sunk down in the seabed, and with the lighthouse built on top of that, just completely surrounded by water. At those lighthouses, there was no room for a separate keeper's house, so the keepers lived inside the towers themselves. Generally, there were males only. Keepers lived without their families for the most part, with exceptions, as I'll tell you. But it was a rough way of life. You know, keepers at those places were paid a bit more because it was considered like hazard pay. But again, you research the history of those places, there's often tragedies in there. So it was a difficult and could be a very dangerous way of life. On the other hand, you had the paradis, or heaven, or paradise stations, which would be a lighthouse on the mainland near a town or city, or on a larger island. Boston Light would be a paradise station because at least you had room for two keepers' houses, although it wasn't a very big island. But at those places, you know, the keepers were able to live in comfortable houses with their families, often multiple families at a lot of them. They often had vegetable gardens and, again, animals, cows and chickens and so forth. And there were safer places to live, you know, more protected from the worst seas and the worst storms. So it's two real extremes and very different ways of life. And this is probably the most famous enfer type lighthouse, or so-called wave-swept or sea-swept lighthouse in New England, one of the most famous in the country. Minus Ledge Light is near Scituate and Cohasset, a little bit south of Boston Harbor. And the lighthouse that's there today is a 114-foot granite tower. And the film you're seeing here, this aerial film was taken by the late historian Edward Rowe Snow. I'm sure some of you here remember him. I'm going to talk more about him in a minute. But some of the waves in this film actually go over the top of the lighthouse. So this is the second lighthouse built in this location. That wave goes over the top right there. But I want to tell you about the first lighthouse that was built there at Minot's Ledge. There's a map on the left showing its location near Cohasset and Scituate. And on the right, it's probably hard for you to read that from the audience, but basically that's the Cohasset Rocks. It's an area of dangerous ledges and rocks where there were many shipwrecks over the years. And I.W.P. Lewis was an engineer who did a really important report to Congress that led to the reorganization of our lighthouse service. And he said in his 1843 report that a lighthouse was needed there more than anywhere else on the seaboard of New England. He pointed out that there have been 40 vessels, more than 40 vessels wrecked there from 1832 to 41, some with loss of life. So finally, the government, Congress, put up the money for a lighthouse. But I should mention that until we formed a more efficient lighthouse board, a national lighthouse board in 1852, our government was more concerned with saving money. So we kind of lagged behind England and Scotland and France in building lighthouses, especially at locations like this. In England, they had the famous Eddystone Light in the English Channel. Bell Rock Light in Scotland was a similar wave-swept lighthouse, Granite Tower. When they said they were going to build a lighthouse at Minot's Ledge, a lot of people said, well, you've got to build a granite tower like the ones over there. But ultimately, this first lighthouse there was built for $39,500, which was a lot of money then, but not enough to build a granite tower in a place like that. So they hired an engineer, Captain William Swift, to design a lighthouse, within that budget. And this is what he came up with. So this was the first lighthouse that went into service. It took about 3 years to build, and it went into service in 1850. 70-foot tower and all, with iron piles drilled down into the rock, and a 2-floor apartment for the keepers, surmounted by the light at the top. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have been thrilled taking a keeper position at this lighthouse. So this is the first keeper. This is Isaac Dunham, who's from Bridgewater, Mass. His son, Isaac Jr., was an assistant. There was another assistant. 2 would be on the lighthouse at a time. 1 would be on shore leave. Right from the start, Isaac Dunham said the lighthouse swayed back and forth in storms. He said sometimes it swayed 2 feet in each direction, which had to be terrifying. So and this is what he wrote in the log, keeper's log, April 6, 1850, during a storm. The wind east blowing very hard with an ugly sea, which makes the light reel like a drunken man. I hope God will in mercy still the raging sea, or we must perish. God only knows what the end will be. They survived that storm and several others, but in October 1850, Dunham and his son and the other assistant, all 3 of them resigned en masse because they feared they wouldn't live through the storms of winter, and I don't blame them one bit. So the government hired a new keeper. They hired John Bennett, who was a veteran of the Royal Navy from England. We don't have any pictures of him, but this is actually based on a drawing that he did. I didn't do this, but somebody based it on a drawing that he did. And Bennett at first was very confident. He agreed with the designer, Swift, that the waves would just pass right through the legs of the structure and not do any damage. But then he was there for a storm or 2, and he changed his mind. He was afraid it was going to fall. So he actually put in an escape route. You can see the rope going from the top of the lighthouse down to a rock about 100 feet away, and you see a keeper riding like a zip line here in a basket. So, it's pretty self-explanatory, the idea there, and apparently they used it successfully in practice runs, but never in an actual emergency. So, April 1851, the lighthouse had been in service for a little over a year. Early April 1851, there was a big storm that washed away the lighthouse boat. They had just 1 boat that was hanging on davits on the side of the tower, and it was washed away in the storm. So Bennett got a ride into Boston to buy a new boat. He left 2 young assistant keepers in charge at Minot's, 2 guys in their 20s, Joseph Wilson, who was from England, Joseph Antoine, who was from Portugal. They were left there with no boat. There was no choice in the matter. And then a worse storm came in to the area. It did tremendous damage in the Boston waterfront and islands and so forth. April 16th, 1851, remembered as the Minot's Light Gale, for reasons you might guess. So the night of the storm, people in Cohasset and Scituate looked out in the storm, and they could see the flash of that light until very late. Sometime after midnight, they heard the frantic sounding of the fog bell over and over again, like clang, 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 either being rung as a distress signal or just the towers maybe swaying back and forth so fast it was causing the bell to sound like that. In any event, there was soon silence. There was no light. And Bennett went to shore, the keeper, John Bennett, went to shore early in the morning in Cohasset, saw pieces of the lighthouse washing up on shore and articles of his own clothing that he had left there, so he knew what had happened. So apparently the supports holding the lighthouse up kind of snapped one at a time until there just wasn't enough to hold it up, and it fell over sometime in the wee hours of April 17th. And those two young keepers, sadly, apparently tried to swim for shore but didn't make it. They both died of exposure. One of them was found on an island nearby, and the other was found on Nantasket Beach in Hull. So, and this is a note they dropped in a bottle the night of the storm, April 16th. The lighthouse won't stand over tonight. She shakes 2 feet each way now. Joseph Wilson and Joseph Antoine. And this was picked up by a Gloucester fisherman in a bottle sometime later. So that's the sad part of the story. It's a very sad story, but the triumphant part of the story is that a new lighthouse was built, took 5 years to build, and this time they did it right, spent over $300,000, which was a lot of money in the 1850s, and it's built of 1,079 blocks of Quincy granite, the best granite in the Boston area, and the blocks are dovetailed to each other. I'll show you these pictures here. I'm sure a lot of you know that term. It comes from carpentry originally, dovetail joints. Basically, you can see, especially in the picture on the right, the blocks have like tabs and notches, so they fit into each other almost like puzzle pieces. It made it much stronger, and also they had iron dowels connecting the blocks and very strong mortar, and the lighthouse is very much built to last, and it's lasted to this day through all kinds of storms and still in good shape. They would swing the blocks into place with a steam-operated derrick out at the lighthouse. You had to be a good swimmer to be a worker on the project, and they always had a lifeguard on duty, and in 5 years, nobody was seriously hurt or killed in the building of the lighthouse, which is actually pretty amazing, I think. So it went into service in 1860. It is an American civil engineering landmark officially, and really one of the great achievements in lighthouse building in the world. And here's, this is from a newspaper article on the building of the lighthouse, not on the building of the lighthouse, but on life at the lighthouse. And if you look at towards the upper right, there's a picture of a coal stove that would be in a lower floor, and there was a pipe running up through the floors that provided heat, or such as it was. Very Spartan furnishings. Male keepers only lived in the lighthouse. They built a couple of keepers' houses. You see towards the upper left there, an area called Government Island in Cohasset, which was actually part of the mainland. So the families of the keepers would live there, and whatever keepers were off duty would be at the houses there. They generally assigned 3 or 4 male keepers to the lighthouse. 2 or 3 would be out there at a time, with the others on shore leave. They might varied at different times, but like 2 weeks on and a week off. Later, as much as like 29 days off on and then a week off, that type of thing. So anyway, one of the early keepers resigned because he said he couldn't stand round walls anymore. So it was not for everybody, but at this new lighthouse, they never felt like it was going to fall over. When big waves would hit it, the tower might vibrate a little bit, but it never swayed back and forth like that first lighthouse, and they never feared for their lives. They never felt it was going to fall over, and it never did. So Minot's got probably the most famous flash of any lighthouse in the world in 1894. As you probably know, every lighthouse within a close geographic region has to have a distinct characteristic, as it's called, which is the color and or the flash of the light. Some of them are steady lights, but they have to be, mariners have to be able to differentiate them easily from each other, and helps tell their own position by recognizing them. In 1894, the government decided they were going to give every major lighthouse in the country a distinct numeric flash so they could easily be told apart. Minot's was one of the first. One in Virginia was also one of the first. So they gave Minot's a 1-4-3, 1 flash, pause, 4 flashes, pause, 3 flashes. It didn't stand for anything. It was just to differentiate it, not Morse code or anything, but people quickly decided it stood for I love you. 1 for I, 4 for love, and 3 for you. And it became known as the I love you light. And many poems and songs have been written about it. And it's tradition in that area for guys to propose to their sweeties within view of Minot's light and the flash. And I know it's still going on today. So I would say easily the most famous lighthouse flash in the world. This is Edward Rowe Snow. I mentioned him a few minutes ago. I grew up in Lynn, Mass. I later lived in Winthrop, which is right on Boston Harbor. And I grew up in Lynn seeing Edward Rowe Snow on Boston TV and hearing him on radio. He was a maritime historian. He wrote about 40 full-length books and a lot of shorter ones, wrote zillions of newspaper columns for the Quincy Patriot Ledger and the Boston Herald, and was a lecturer all over the place, and again was a media personality on radio and TV. And a great storyteller, had a great voice, and talked about and wrote about shipwrecks and pirates and treasure and lighthouses and just all the cool maritime stuff that makes the New England coast so interesting. One of his books was The Story of Minot's Light. He also took this picture. He was an excellent aerial photographer. He took this picture in 1941, obviously a big wave hitting the lighthouse. But also, on occasion, he would bring a tour to the lighthouse. And this film is from 1940. And you're going to see a group of 100 people that he brought out there going into the lighthouse. It's, no matter how many times I see this, I can't get over it. That's him, that's Edward Rowe Snow in the white t-shirt. So he's relatively young here, he's about 38 here. And you're going to see, you know, women in dresses and men in very fancy suits with hankies in their pockets and everything, going up the ladder. And I've heard him called the Pied, I see the Coast Guard keeper there in the doorway. And by the way, that's 65 feet up. The doorway is 65 feet up approximately from the water. So I've heard him called the Pied Piper of Boston Harbor because he could get people to do things they wouldn't normally do. Shades of Marilyn Monroe there with the dress. But anyway, so eventually all 100 people got to the top of the lighthouse. That's just about the end of the video there. But wait, there's more. He also on occasion dove from the lighthouse. So as a young man, he was very athletic. He actually set track records and stuff when he was a young man. So the picture on the left, he's in his 30s there. That's in the 1930s. But on the right here, I'm going to play you a video clip. This is from 1962 on his 60th birthday. And he told people, get your cameras ready. So in a few seconds here, you're going to see him dive out. So again, 65 feet up, and you got to land between the ledges. You got to know where the ledges are. Even at high tide, it's pretty shallow there. Yeah. His daughter, Dolly, is a really good friend of mine. She's actually very involved in lighthouse preservation herself. She was inside that doorway that day when he dove. She said he did like a Tarzan yell, and then he jumped out. And she said, that's when I knew my father was crazy. But she means that in a good way. You know, he was the kind of guy who lived life to the fullest. He inspired people to get interested in maritime history, including me. He had a lot to do with my interest. I got to meet him a couple of times, which was great. But he never inspired me to jump out of a lighthouse. I passed my 60th birthday several years ago and had no desire to do that. So I want to talk for a few minutes about this lighthouse, which is another wave-swept type lighthouse in East Penobscot Bay. In Maine, if you know the geography up there at all, you got Vinyl Haven Island, a very large island off of Rockland in mid-coast Maine, and to the east of that, you've got Isle of Ho, another very large island. I'm not sure how many miles in between them. They're pretty far apart from each other, and this lighthouse is approximately halfway between those two big islands, and it's about 7 miles from the nearest mainland harbor of Stonington. In other words, it's out in the middle of nowhere on a barren ledge. It was built in 1839. And it's actually, of our early lighthouses, it's one of the better built ones. A lot of our early lighthouses are not well built, but this one was. It was designed by Alexander Paris, a very well-known architect. And it's a shorter version of Minot's in a way, made of granite blocks. The amazing thing about this is that the government saw fit at the beginning to have a keeper living at this lighthouse with his family. And this is Watson Hopkins, a painting of him. He was the first keeper. And he wrote a letter to Congress a few years later describing his job. He said he took the job upon a salary of $450 per year, which was like a lower middle class salary. It wasn't actually awful, but it certainly wasn't very good. I live with my family in the tower, the only building on the ledge. I'm obliged to bring my water from shore a distance of 7 miles. So he had to row a dory 7 miles to Stonington to get water and row back 7 miles to bring water to his family. My family consists of 9 persons. He and his wife had 6 kids when he took the job. His wife had a baby in the lighthouse, if you can believe it. Yeah. And a descendant of his who sent me the photograph of this painting that you see here also told me that it was family tradition that after the baby was born in the lighthouse, somebody came out to take the mother and baby to shore in a boat. And as the baby was being passed to somebody in the boat, the baby was dropped into the ocean, but somebody managed to pluck her out by her clothes and saved her, and she was okay. And she lived to be a very prominent citizen of Vinalhaven, lived well into her 80s. So anyway, just a little aside there. So there was a living room, 2 chambers in the tower, plus a cellar. So this family of 9, including a baby, was living in 3 rooms and a cellar in a granite tower on a barren ledge out in the middle of nowhere in the ocean. The iron railing secured to the rock around the towers, but all swept away. Also the privy, which was carried away the first storm after its erection. It's like adding insult to injury. You know, their outhouse was washed away. The windows all leak in storms, etc. So he actually went on for a while. It's mind-boggling to think of this family living there in those conditions year-round. You know, they were out there through the winter. They were out there year-round. The most amazing thing of all is that they were there 10 years. Yeah. He ended up buying a farm. Excuse me. He ended up buying a farm on Vinalhaven, and it was on the east coast of Vinalhaven. So in theory, he would have been able to look out from there and see Saddleback Ledge Lighthouse in the distance, but he probably never looked that way again, I would bet. But you know, lighthouse keeper jobs in the first, up until at least until the 1850s, were very political in nature. It depended on who you knew in government, and you had to support the right political party to keep your job. So someplace like Portland Headlight in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, which some of you I'm sure know, would be considered a plum job, you know, a very comfortable keeper's house. And some of the ones on the Cape were certainly pretty comfortable on the mainland. So there would be a lot of competition for those jobs, and you really had to be in political favor to have a job at those lights. With Saddleback, I don't think there was a line of people waiting for that job. I think that's why I kept it for 10 years. I think absolutely nobody else wanted that job. So. And another so-called, I would call this a wave-swept lighthouse. It's also what people call a spark plug light. Because it looks like a spark plug, but it's also a caisson light. So the bottom part is the base is called a caisson. Usually the caisson will be sunk down into the seabed. In this case, at Whale Rock in Rhode Island, it was bolted to the ledge, and then the cast iron superstructure built on top of that, and the keepers lived inside that superstructure. Whale Rock was built in 1884. It was always a males-only station, no families. I want to tell you what happened in the summer of 1897 there. Head keeper was Judson Allen, a veteran of the Lighthouse Service, and Henry Nygren was an assistant, and for some reason they had a feud. I guess it was going on for some months. They hated each other, and I don't know how it started. But one night, one hot August night, we all know what those are like, in 1897, Allen went up to light the light at sunset, the most important part of the job. He was in his bare feet, and as he was lighting the light, Nygren showed up in the lantern room, came up the stairs and the ladder, and attacked Allen with what was described as a butcher's knife. So they wrestled for the knife. Allen knocked the knife out of Nygren's hand. The knife went bouncing down the stairs of the lighthouse. Allen lowered himself by rope down the side of the lighthouse, and you see a boat here on davits. There were 2 boats there. He got one of the boats down into the water, started rowing as fast as he could for his life. Meanwhile, Nygren grabbed a shotgun and actually fired shots at Allen. And then eventually Nygren got the other boat, got it in the water, and there was a chase in these 2 boats to shore. Allen got to shore, started running. You know, if it was a movie, you wouldn't believe it, but he ducked into a cornfield on his hands and knees. He disappeared, so Nygren couldn't find him. Nygren gave up. He rowed the boat back out to the lighthouse. 2 guys from a local life-saving service were sent out later that night to apprehend him, to take him into custody. And they came back and they reported that when they got out there, he was dancing wildly at the top of the lighthouse and throwing plates and utensils off the top of the lighthouse. So I think they very wisely decided to let him sleep it off, and they waited until the next day to go back and take him into custody. The only follow-up I've seen is that a mention that he was fired from the Lighthouse Service. That's not exactly a surprise, but I've never seen anything that said he went to prison or anything like that. You would think that maybe he did. But anyway, it's an extreme example, but not that unusual. Generally, keepers at these more remote lighthouses did a great job, are very dedicated, got along with each other. But if there were keepers at these places that their personalities clashed for one reason or another, if there was alcoholism or mental illness, all these things would be exacerbated, living in a place like that through all kinds of storms and winter and everything else. So I have run into other cases along those lines, so not tremendously unusual. And I thought I'd throw in just a little bit here about a local wave-swept lighthouse, Bishop and Clerk's, which I'm sure a lot of you know about. It's not there anymore. It's a lost lighthouse, but it was on the approach from the south to Hyannis Harbor. It's off of Yarmouth, off of Great Island, or Point Gammon, where there's also an old lighthouse. This actually replaced the light on Point Gammon. And it was in the tradition of Minot's, a tall granite tower, had a bell tower attached to it, as you can see there with the workings for the bell in there. And I want to mention Charles Hinckley, the guy on the left in this picture, was the keeper for quite a few years. I don't talk about him all the time, so I'm forgetting the years he was there, but late 1800s into the early 1900s, and I think it was 20-something years he was keeper. He was considered to be probably the shortest lighthouse keeper in the world. And one article said he was 4'9", but another one said he was 4'7" in his stocking feet. And this is a quote from an interview he did in I think it was about 1904. He said, "It requires lots of philosophy to be a light keeper on an outside station," meaning an offshore station like that. At Bishop and Clerk's, for example, the keeper has 20 days on and 10 days off. In the year 1903, for 48 days, the Sound was full of ice and at times was piled around the light to the height of 20 feet. So it was a pretty bad winter, I guess. The other guy in this picture, by the way, was named Walter Carney. He was a local ferry captain, and Hinckley referred to them as the long and short of the service, he said. His was his daughter or granddaughter? Again, I just inserted this last minute into my lecture, so I don't have all the facts at the tip of my tongue here. But I forget if it was his daughter, or I think it was a granddaughter, who wrote later that when she would visit there as a girl, he always was cooking lobsters and cornbread inside the lighthouse, and she loved visiting. It always smelled good to her. So by the early 1950s, Bishop and Clerk's light was in horrible shape. As you can see, it was tilting, blocks were missing, it was almost ready to fall over on its own, and it would have eventually, I'm sure, unless it was restored, of course, which it wasn't. It was decided by the Coast Guard that it should be destroyed because it had been discontinued as an aid to navigation. So on September 11th, 1952, that's what was done to it. They used dynamite, and a lot of boats were out there to watch the spectacle, and it was described as toppling like a pile of children's blocks when it went over, and that's all that was left on the... But part of the old base still stands with a very nondescript automatic light on it now, which some of you are probably familiar with. So I just want to talk briefly about women keepers, and I want to make the point that in this country there were thousands of male keepers, but there are also hundreds of female lighthouse keepers. A lot of times, if you had a male keeper, you wanted more than one person in the household to know how to do the job in case the man fell ill or died suddenly or was detained away or whatever the case may be. So a lot of wives and a lot of daughters learned how to keep the lights and fog signals. And sometimes, if the man then died or whatever was incapacitated, some of the women, the wives or daughters who already knew how to do the job and were already living at the place, they got the appointment as keeper. And that happened in quite a few places, including this place. This is Lime Rock Light, excuse me, which is inside Newport Harbor in Rhode Island. Not much of a lighthouse. You see the light. This is the light right here on the side of the keeper's house. It's an inner harbor light, so you didn't need a tall, 200-foot lighthouse like some of the ones you have on the coast. Just a little light on the side of the building to provide a light for a couple of miles inside the harbor. And it went into service in the mid-1850s, and a man named Hosea Lewis was the first keeper. This is his daughter, Ida. Hosea Lewis had a stroke soon after he took the job. And from the time she was about 13 years old, Ida learned how to take care of that light. And she was basically the keeper for about 56 years, from the time she was a young teenager. She didn't get the title of keeper until she was about 40 years old, but she was doing the job for quite a while before that. And she ended up becoming one of the most famous women in America in the late 1800s. She was considered the best handler of a dory in Newport, which is saying a lot for a place like Newport. Very strong, not very big, but very strong. And she was credited with rescuing at least 18 people from drowning during her years there. But people think the number is probably more than 30 because she was very modest. She didn't like talking about her rescues, so some of them are not very well recorded. But she rescued a minimum of 18 people. And some of them were quite dramatic. I don't have time to go into detail, but I'll mention one where 3 young guys were transporting a rare sheep to the Belmont family at one of the mansions in Newport. They were walking the sheep along the shore, just one rare sheep. And so the sheep tried to escape by swimming out into the harbor. And these guys found a little skiff that actually belonged to Ida Lewis's brother. They jumped in the skiff, and it wasn't meant for 3 people, I think, and they went after the sheep, and the thing kind of sunk around them. It was just too much for this little boat. And they're struggling in the harbor, and Ida went out in her dory, and this is typically what she would do. She would grab them by like the collar and haul them up into her boat. She had to be so strong to do that. And she brought them back to the house, and one of them mentioned the sheep that they were transporting. So she looked out and could see the sheep struggling in the harbor. She went back out and roped the sheep and rescued it and brought it back. She rescued the sheep too. So at least 18 people and at least 1 sheep. But she really became very famous. In 1869, she rescued 2 soldiers from nearby Fort Adams. They were in a small boat, I believe it was a sailboat, during a snowstorm with a young boy, a local teenage boy who was supposedly helping to guide them. And apparently they shouldn't have been out there in the storm. But anyway, the boat capsized, and sadly the boy drowned. But Ida's mother saw the 2 soldiers struggling in the harbor, and Ida had a bad cold at the time. She went out with not wearing winter clothes and not wearing shoes, rushed out and again hauled them up into her boat and saved those 2 soldiers. That made national newspapers, got a lot of national attention. She got on the cover of Harper's Weekly, the leading periodical of the day. The people of Newport gave her this fancy dory with mahogany seats and gold-plated oarlocks, paraded her through the streets of Newport for the 4th of July parade. She hated every minute of that. She was very modest. I should mention that President Grant came to visit her. Susan B. Anthony came to visit, and she said those visits were more stressful than her rescues. She really was an extremely famous person. I think a lot of it was that people were so used to men, knowing about male lighthouse keepers, and I think people were surprised to hear that a woman could do that job and do such a good job and save people like that and everything. It was kind of a novelty to people. She actually became the highest paid lighthouse keeper in the country for a while, which is saying a lot considering women are still struggling for equal pay, but she actually was the highest paid keeper for a while. She died at 69 in 1911, had a big funeral attended by all the local lighthouse keepers and many other people, and they named the light after her after she died. It was Lime Rock before that, but they named it the Ida Lewis light after her. Only case I know of like that. And later it became the Ida Lewis Yacht Club, so that's why you have decks around the outside of it. It is a yacht club now. The light is not an aid to navigation, but the staff of the yacht club turn the light on every night in the summer as a tribute to her. So I'm getting near the end here. I just want to say just a little bit more about technology. This is that beautiful Fresnel lens at Boston Light. And the picture on the right, it looks a little too dark on the screen there, so I see it better on my computer screen. But that's a picture I took when I got to stay overnight at Boston Light a few years ago on the couch at the invitation of Sally Snowman, the keeper. But it's just a gorgeous lens from 1859. There's still quite a few of those beautiful old classical Fresnel lenses in place in lighthouses. Approximately 10% of our lighthouses still have them. But otherwise, they've been replaced by various so-called modern optics. On the left, you have a rotating aerobeacon type of light. Those have mostly been phased out. There's very few of those left. In the middle, you have something called a VRB25, a rotating acrylic light. And then on the right, you have an LED light called a VLB44. And by the way, the one in the center and on the right are made by the Vega company in New Zealand, but I believe it's been sold to somebody in another country, and I can't quite think of where. But anyway, those LEDs like that are now the prevalent form of light used at offshore lighthouses, and they're always solar powered and relatively cheap and do the job. The light can be seen, the distance needed, They're maybe not quite as beautiful as the Fresnel lenses. You can decide yourself, but they do the job for little cost and don't require a lot of attention from the Coast Guard. So, whoops. So this is my kind of my home base, my home away from home. I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Portsmouth Harbor Light is at the entrance to Portsmouth Harbor, which is also the entrance to the Piscataqua River, but it's actually in the town of Newcastle. It's on a Coast Guard station. You see the main Coast Guard building in the background there. You see the old keeper's house to the right of the lighthouse, and also the remains of Fort Constitution, a very historic fort by the lighthouse. So there's a lot of history there. The first lighthouse at this location was the first lighthouse north of Boston in the American colonies in 1771. So I want to tell you a little bit about the last keeper here. Elson Small came in 1946. He and his wife Connie just lived there 2 years at the end of 28 years at Lighthouses. And when they moved to Portsmouth Harbor Light, after living just on islands off the main coast for 26 years, this is the first place where they could actually drive to their home instead of taking a boat to their home. It's also the first place that had electricity. They were quite thrilled about that. Connie went on at the age of 85 to write this book, a classic book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife, which I recommend very, very highly. The organization I'm part of, Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses, actually joined with University of Maine Press to keep this in print a couple of years ago. But it's just a great book. And I was lucky enough to know Connie personally. She lived to be 103. She passed away in 2005. I interviewed her on video when she was 96 with my VHS camcorder at the home where she was living in Portsmouth. And I'm going to play you a clip of Connie Small talking about having electricity for the first time. So just to set it up, she was really looking forward to it, and it was exciting and fun to have electricity, but it was also sort of a letdown in a way. So I'll play, this is about a 2-minute clip.
Electricity course, and the first electricity was when we came to Portsmouth Harbor. And of course he said, well, we'll go up and light to get the light. So we went up and finally he said, press the button, and I pressed the button, and I, no film, and I got the light right now. And I thought, what has happened? What is the reason? And so I went down to the kitchen, sat down, and began to think about it. What in the world, why, what now? And we looked forward to it as a big thing. Then I realized we had to give 20 minutes of ourselves to light that light. And we had put part of us into it. And that needed something. But just to press the button, that was nothing. You see what I mean? And so that's my first. But when I went back, I went in the house. So what I could do, we went on an electric binge. About everything we could extra.
So to me, she was a delightful person, so I like showing clips of her, but it kind of illustrates a point. I think you'd agree, as we move forward with technology, we often lose things along the way. I think that's pretty obvious. With lighthouses, it's really obvious. As they electrified the lights and automated them, we've lost having lighthouse keepers and families caring for these places on a daily basis, which is why we have groups like the American Lighthouse Foundation, U.S. Lighthouse Society, and Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses is a chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation. I don't want to do a big commercial here, but these are the keepers of today. And so I founded this Friends group in 2001. American Lighthouse Foundation has a license from the Coast Guard to take care of the lighthouse there. It's still owned by the Coast Guard. We used to have Sunday open houses every week, sometimes as many as 300 people in a 4-hour open house. So you see the line there on the left. But now that's one of our volunteers, Ruth Knowles in the pink there, giving a tour. But now we just do small tours by reservation, no more than 8 people. And we do 2 tours on Friday nights and 3 on Sunday afternoons. So if you're coming to our area, sign up for a tour. I was just there yesterday giving tours. It's a lot of fun. And Anne, when she introduced me, mentioned the podcast I do for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. It's called Lighthearted. It means people have lighthouses in their hearts. And I've done over 200 episodes over the last more than 3 years now. I have a ball doing it. I love doing it. I get to interview people all over the country, all over the world. Sometimes in person, but I do a lot of interviews via Zoom. I was just in England and Ireland for a month, for the month of July. and I interviewed some people on that trip. So I've interviewed people, quite a few outside of this country. And I did want to mention Ken Morton, who's one of the sponsors of this program, and I've known him a long time. He owns Sandy Neck Light here in Barnstable, at the entrance to Barnstable Harbor. And that lighthouse, as some of you probably remember, used to be a headless lighthouse. And actually, it was a chapter of the American Lighthouse. The Cape Cod chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation joined forces with Ken Morton to get a new replica lantern installed on the lighthouse, so it looks like a real lighthouse again. But that's me on the left with Ken Morton in 2004 at the top of the tower before the new lantern was put on. So Ken does a great job managing the property for his family that owns the lighthouse, and I just have a lot. Whoops, I forgot that I had that clip there. Wait a minute. Let me go back for a second. I have a lot of respect for Ken, and I do want to play a little clip here of the interview I did with him on the podcast. I think this is about 1 minute, so let me play this for you.
There aren't that many people who can say, I am a lighthouse. As a talking point, it's hard to beat. The Sandy Neck Lighthouse is kind of an icon of the region. Pride's not the right word, because I feel like pride is something you should have if you've actually accomplished something. But it's really kind of joyful to be the guy in charge of this Cape Cod, Barnstable icon. That, you know, it's in the Cape Cod Times almost weekly, it seems, just because there's nothing better to take a photo of. At some point in the future, as sea levels rise, there's going to be an issue about just how much effort are we going to put into not letting this fall into the water. But we're not there yet, and it looks great with its new coat of paint right now in 2021.
So, if you want to listen to the whole thing, check out the podcast. Those of you who have podcast apps in your phone, just do a search, use your favorite podcast app, do a search for Light Space Hearted, 2 words, and you'll find it. Or go to the U.S. Lighthouse Society website, which is in this list here, uslhs.org. My own website, newenglandlighthouses.net. American Lighthouse Foundation, Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. I didn't talk about Friends of Flying Santa at all, but Edward Rowe Snow, along with all those other things, was the flying Santa to lighthouses for over 40 years. He would drop presents out of a plane at Christmas time for lighthouse keepers and their families as a way of showing appreciation, and that is still done today by helicopter to Coast Guard stations. So it's a fun thing to read about. And there's some books I recommend too, so I won't go over them out loud, but if you want to read a good novel, maybe some of you have already read it, but the bottom on the list there, Light Between Oceans by M.L. Stedman, a best-selling novel about a lighthouse keeper in Australia, also a very good movie. I recommend both the book and movie. So you can put the light on if you'd like. That brings me to the end, and I'm sorry if I went on long. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you very much. Do we have time to take some questions? Can I ask for questions? Do we have time for that, or what's happening? I'm not sure if I should be asking for questions. Yeah? Yes. Minutes, yeah. I have not. It's funny you asked that, because just today on the way here, I interviewed 3 people at Situate Light for the podcast, and we talked about that. One of them had been in it. I have not been in it. I was supposed to go one day with the Coast Guard, and the seas were too rough that day, so it was canceled. So I have not been inside it. I've been around it, and I've flown over it. I've seen it from every possible angle, but I haven't been in it. But I know the owner. It's now privately owned. It's one of the ones that's been auctioned by the government, because when they put it up for transfer at no cost, nobody applied. So it was then auctioned to the general public. So this is about 7 or 8 years ago now. It was bought by a man named Bobby Sager, S-A-G-E-R, who lives, I think he's got multiple houses, but he's got a condo in Boston. And he also owns Boone Island Light off southern Maine, and he owns a lighthouse in Michigan. He's former chairman of Polaroid. He's a fantastic photographer. Good friends with Sting, the singer. Actually works with him a lot. But anyway, so he owns Minutes Light. He's had some work done out there, but I think it's more problematic than he realized, I have to say. You know, it's a pretty daunting thing to take on a lighthouse like that. It's not for everybody. You better be in good shape and pretty fearless to do that, yeah. Anybody else? Yes? That's the $64,000 question. I wonder about that too. I mean, under this, okay, they passed an act in 2000, the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act, and under that, the government's been giving away usually a few lighthouses each year, and often it's to nonprofits. They take applications. A committee in the National Park Service picks the winner, but if they don't get any good applications, they auction them. So a lot of them have been auctioned, including Minot's. In many cases, the private owners have been great. Not in every case. Some of them have basically done nothing. They've owned a lighthouse for 15 years or something and not touched it, not even gone to it. That's happened in some cases. But even in the cases where they're well taken care of, I do wonder about that. I mean, can we count on the next generations and that person's family? I mean, do they have kids? If they do, are they going to want to do it? I don't know the answer to that yet. So it's my hope that they are setting up some sort of mechanism, whether it's just actually set up a nonprofit or some way of, in perpetuity, taking care of that place. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I wonder the same thing myself all the time. Yeah. But some of these private owners are really great. Dave Waller, a friend of mine, owns Graves Light in Outer Boston Harbor. You might have seen him. It's been on the news a lot and on TV, and he's just done an amazing job there. Yeah. Yes? I actually have a more extensive version of it that I could email to anybody who wants it. I actually have it on my laptop here, but let me see if I can bring up the more complete version. But I can email it to anybody who wants it. I can email it to Ann. I can do that. This is the longer version of the list. Yeah, if I don't think of it right away, when I get home, email me, Ann, and I'll send it to you.
You spoke about all of the things that which Snow did.
Yeah.
He presented the first lecture at Tales from Cape Cod about 50 years ago.
Wow, that is fantastic. I had no idea. I'm not surprised. I mean, he spoke all over New England. That is fantastic. And that you just reminded me of something else. I've realized today, August 22nd, today is August 22nd, that was the date, August 22nd, 1860, the date the second Minot's Light, the present Minot's Light was lit, August 22nd, 1860. So it's the anniversary of that. That's so cool about Edward Rowe Snow. I had no idea. Any other questions? Well, thank you. Oh, there's a question. Wait.
They've had to move certain lighthouses because they're too close.
Yes.
Because of erosion.
Yep. Yeah, they have moved quite. She's asking about moving lighthouses because of erosion. That's another subject I could do a whole lecture on. There's been several major lighthouse moves. Cape Hatteras in North Carolina probably being the best known. 200-foot tower, the tallest lighthouse in the country, being moved something like 300 feet back from the edge of the eroding beach there in 1999 for $12 million, so it cost a lot more now. International Chimney Corporation, which is now known as, I think, ICC Commonwealth, is the company that's moved the lighthouses, all the major lighthouse moves they've done. They did Highland Light on the Cape in North Row and Nauset in Eastham as well, and Block Island, Southeast Light in Rhode Island. Those are all major jobs they've done. But most recently, actually, Gay Head on Martha's Vineyard and Sankaty Head on Nantucket. So a lot of the ones have been in New England at these eroding bluffs. But it's a fascinating subject. It's absolutely amazing what they've been able to do. But some of them are gonna be, threatened in the coming years. So if we're gonna save them all, some are gonna have to be moved. Some more are gonna have to be moved.
Excuse me.
Yep.
I'm going to leave this up here with the books, and if you want to receive that information, please put your name down here, and I'll add you to our constant contact list and send it out probably tomorrow or the next day. Okay?
Excellent.
Really ought to
Thank you. I do have some of my books if anybody's interested.